Hello students, welcome to this class. So in this video I'm going to discuss the 4 phases of emergency management. Okay, the 4 phases of emergency management. So that's why you can see I wrote EM here. Okay, so to start, first we need to introduce these 4 phrases. Okay, so the first phrase, or what people normally talk about, the first one is mitigation. Okay, so what does mitigation mean? Mitigation means you try to make something not happen. Okay, so for example, to mitigate the residential fire, do not store the flammable liquid in your home, right? So to when government wants to help the citizens to mitigate the hazards, government will set up some laws or principles. So you can see a lot of like a principle or regulation say you cannot store the flammable liquid, especially very close to the like a fire or very close to the stove, right? So this is some strategies called mitigation. You set up some laws, you set up some principles, or sometimes you do some analysis, right? Help citizens to choose the location of their homes. For example, the FEMA have the flooding map. So before you purchase your house, you can go online to check the flooding map, so you will not live in the flooding area, right? This is called mitigation, right? So before something happen, you try to mitigate, or you try to make sure it will not happen, right? So this is first phrase of emergency management. So the second phrase of the emergency management is called preparedness. Right, so preparedness means you prepare something to last the impacts of a disaster. For example, if you understand earthquake would happen, right? So you provide some trainings, you provide some public educations to your citizens, try to last the impact, right? So once earthquake really happen, your citizens would know how to do to protect themselves and their family members, right? So this is called preparedness. Preparedness normally incorporate 3 major components. The first one is called education, right? So it's public education and also the education to the professional first responders. So the second thing is the training, right? Training to the first responders and also training to some specific group. For example, you need to provide trainings to like the trunk drivers who transport the gasolines, right? Make sure they would drive their trunk in a like a safety ways, right? So you have the education, you have the training, then finally you have the exercise to evaluate the effectiveness of your training and your education, right? So preparedness normally have 3 things, right? So I wrote here education, right? Training, right? And also you have the exercise, right? So the purpose of the exercise is to test the first 2 things, right? So this is the first phrase, right? The second is preparedness, right? Mitigation includes some like a set up the laws, right? Then you do some analysis, right? For example, you analyze what are the flooding areas in your area, in your community, right? And avoid citizens to build their houses in the flooding area. So we have two phrases. So the third phrase is called response. Right? So after you mitigate disaster, then you prepare disasters, right? So when disaster really happen, you have the response. So normally you try to respond to disasters, but later in this class we'll talk about the different strategies on how to respond to disasters. So there are actually some principles, some strategies, and some common ways to respond to disasters. So later in this class we will talk about that, right? So the final phrase is called recovery. Right? So after you respond to disasters, the next thing you need to think about is how to recover for that. So recovery normally have two phrases. So it's short term and you have the long-term recovery. Right? So the difference between short-term and the long-term is short-term normally happen right after or during response. Let me say again, short-term normally happen right after or during response. Long-term means couple years plan. For example, the city of New Orleans still under the process of the long-term recovery from Hurricane Katrina, right? So long-term recovery normally take a lot of time, right? So right now we have the mitigation, we have preparedness, we have response, we have recovery. So in the traditional disaster emergency management book will tell you, okay, you mitigate the hazards, then you start to prepare for your response, right? But once disaster happen here, then you need to prepare to respond to the disasters, right? Then from response, once you start to respond to disaster, then you go to the recovery, right? Then once you finish recovery, you connect to the mitigation, right? So it's more like a cycle here. Mitigate, prepare, then respond, then recover from the disasters. Okay, so this chart is very common if you read the traditional emergency management textbook like this. But recently, based on the like a disaster researchers, actually this picture should be different. Okay, I'm going to show you what is the difference. So again, we have the mitigation, right? So you remember there are two things. So right, set up those, do the analysis, right? So if we put a mitigation as a big circle, right, like this phrase, it actually overlap to the circle of preparedness, right? So it actually overlap to the circle of preparedness, right? So what are the three major components of the preparedness? Remember what we said? Education, right? Training, and what? Exercise, right? So actually mitigation overlaps to the preparedness, right? There are some overlap here. So preparedness, this blue circle, also overlap to the circle of what? Response. Right? So how you prepare for disaster would define how you respond to disaster. So there are some overlaps here, right? And the response, this red circle also overlap to the circle of recovery. Okay, so this is more accurate four phases, the relationship between four phases of emergency management. I'm going to explain why. Okay, so again, mitigation, during a mitigation phase, you set up the lows principles, and then you conduct the analysis, right? So based on these lows principles and the analysis, you need to decide how are you going to prepare for the disaster, right? What kind of courses you are going to provide to the public to educate your first responders. What are the training courses you are going to provide to the first responders or some special groups, right? Then how can you design your exercise to test, to evaluate the effectiveness of education and the training, right? So that's why mitigation has some overlaps to the preparedness, because mitigation actually, when you are doing the mitigation, some of the strategies you are utilizing in mitigation can also be regarded as preparedness, right? For example, when you analyze the risk in the community, you are also prepared for the risk in the community. This analysis will also define how are you going to prepare for the disaster. Okay, so if you can follow this concept, you can easily understand actually preparedness has some overlaps to response, right? Because how you prepare for disasters would determine how you are going to respond to disasters. Okay, for example, in the United States, you need to prepare trainings of the incident command system to all first responders, right? So again, how you prepare for disasters would define how you are going to respond to disasters, right? So that's why there are some overlaps, right? So some strategies you are utilizing also connect to the response phase. Okay, so if you can follow me, then why response can overlap to recovery? Because once you respond to disasters, right, you also initiate the short-term recovery. For example, in a residential fire, right? So once you evacuate, once you search and rescue the citizen, the next big question in the incident commander's mind is how to relocate these citizens, right? How to relocate these citizens are actually overlap to the short-term recovery. Okay, so again, once you respond to disasters, you also initiate the short-term recovery. Remember the two things we say, short-term and the long-term. Okay, so finally, after you relocate the citizens, next thing, after a couple years, you need to think about how to rebuild the community, right? How to rebuild the building, how to rebuild their homes. But one thing you want to avoid is to rebuild the whole community in a flooding area, right? Or in the wildfire area. So again, you need to do what? Do analysis, right? So that's why recovery, especially the long-term recovery, will eventually overlap to the mitigation. Okay, so based on the most recent emergency management research, the four phases of emergency management should be like this. So the four phases overlaps to each other. Mitigation overlaps to preparedness, right? Because the loss and the analysis you did in this phase will determine determine how you are going to educate your citizens, what kind of courses you are going to provide to your first responders, and what kind of exercise you are going to have to evaluate the education and the training, right? So again, preparedness also overlaps to a response, right? Because how you prepare for disasters would determine how you respond to disasters, right? Also, response overlaps to recovery, because once you respond to disasters, you also initiate the short-term recovery. So the final one is the long-term recovery. Before you rebuild a community, you rebuild your homes, you need to do some analysis, right? You connect back to the mitigation. Okay, so this is the very fundamental concept of the 4 phases of emergency management. Again, if you have any question, if you want to have further information, welcome to email me. So anytime. So in our other videos, I will talk about the specifically each phase of the emergency management. Okay, thank you very much. Please email me if you have any question. Bye bye.